Good morning. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we meet and we learn from each other today on country. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Gadigal people. This comparatively young library sits on their very ancient library of oral tradition. And I pay my sincere respects to elders past and present and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are here with us this morning. Welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rachel Franks. I'm the Coordinator of Scholarship here at the State Library of New South Wales, which means I get to look after the library's fellows and I get to sit alongside them as they do really extraordinary research on a vast range of topics. It's unusual though, and it might seem a little bit counterintuitive, for some of our projects to actually focus on books. Many people would think it's a library, it is all about books, but many of our topics are actually about all sorts of other things. So it's very exciting today to have Martyn Lyons, who is an Emeritus Professor of History at the University of New South Wales, and he was also our Merewether Fellow back in 2003. And he is talking all about books this morning and all about reading. If you have any questions for Martyn, please use the chat feature in Zoom and I'll be back in a little bit to ask those questions. Thanks so much, Martyn. Over to you.
Thanks, Rachel. I hope you can hear me okay. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. And thanks for the opportunity to talk a little bit about what I've been doing in the State Library during my tenure of the Merewether Fellowship, which I gratefully acknowledge, of course, the support of the State Library for this project. So Australia is and always has been a reading society, but what did Australians read? That's the simple question that's really the launching pad for this research project. I'm going to, I try to answer it in terms of books rather than newspapers, because there's only so much one person can take on at a time, any one time. And I consider the long 19th century, 1788 to 1901, with a few forays beyond 1901 occasionally. And in the wake of that original, very simple question, a few other questions follow on or flow on. For example, how did Australians acquire the books they read? How did, for example, readers in the outback overcome the problems of distance and remoteness? And why did they read? Did they read for pleasure, for instruction, for spiritual sustenance, and so on? And to focus more specifically on today's topic, what was their relation? How did they respond to the books they read? And what was their relationship with the canonical books of English literature with which they were very familiar? Well, there are several paths of inquiry leading into the history of reading in 19th century Australia. One approach has been to build on the history of public institutions, like public libraries and other kinds of lending institutions. Book historians have focused on, for example, early auction catalogues, which was Elizabeth Webby's speciality, subscription library lending data, which has been used by Tim Dolin and other scholars, and fiction published in newspapers, which was Catherine Bode's great contribution to this field. Their materials have mainly come from institutions like publishing houses, bookshops, circulating lending libraries, or the Mechanics' Institute libraries. That's been a very profitable approach, but it tackles reading from the supply side rather than from the consumer's viewpoint. What about the readers? What were their reading tastes and what place did reading play in their lives in this period? What did they make of the text that they read? How did they respond to the literary classics, novels, poetry, and so on. In this project, I want to approach the history of reading from a different angle. I'm less interested in the supply of books and more interested in their reception. So I'm aiming for a reader-oriented history. And I tried to follow the advice given a long time ago now by the American scholar Jonathan Rose in an influential article in which he urged us to interrogate the audience. So in order to do that, I turned to autobiographical sources where we can find reflections on reading and writing in abundance. When I mention autobiographical sources, I'm using the term in a very broad sense. I understand by that not only formal autobiographies, but also other kinds of ego documents, as we call them, memoirs, diaries, journals, including those produced by emigrants on their long voyage to Australia, and various travelers' accounts. Those ego documents can bring individual readers to life, give them a more rounded personality than book production statistics ever managed to do, and they help us to see their overall profile as readers. In their own writings, individual readers often describe their reading experiences since childhood. And those personal sources lead us to flesh and blood readers and writers who write about their books, their preferences, their loves and hates, and they inform us consciously and sometimes unconsciously about the status and function of reading and writing in different phases of their lives. Autobiographies, of course, produce quite heterogeneous testimony because everyone has different tastes, but a few common themes shape the kind of working hypothesis that I'm using. One theme, apart from the perennial importance of Shakespeare and the Bible, is the popularity and influence of the English literary canon, as well as the mutations that it underwent. We must ask how far the responses of Australian readers echoed those readers elsewhere in the British Empire, and how far they favoured a particularly Australian reading of, say, the Bible, Charles Dickens, or Robinson Crusoe. Unlike today's readers, the majority loved poetry, memorized it and recited it, and the rich oral culture of poetry reading has to also be recognized. Books held the empire together, and they enabled settlers in Australia to connect and identify with Britain. The empire shared a literary heritage, which formed a common ground. Macaulay's History of England, for example, was recently nominated as one of the 10 books that shaped the British Empire, and that choice would have resonated loudly with many Australian readers. But as books travelled, their interpretation changed according to local circumstances. As Isabel Hofmeyr showed for the export of Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress to Africa, the reception of books is coloured by their readers' own cultural environments. And we need to register those nuances in the Australian context too. The export of imperial print culture didn't automatically replicate the values of empire overseas. Its reception depended on a process of negotiation and resistance. Reader resistance, of course, appears most obviously if we consider convict reading and the encounters of First Nations people with the written word. And later in the century, Australian nationalists also developed independent literary preferences, which bypassed the English literary canon. Consider the example of Joseph Townsend's reading of Virgil. Townsend arrived from England in 1842, settling in Ulladulla and making excursions to the south coast of New South Wales. And he published his impressions of the colony in London in 1849. Quoting freely, when I say quoting freely from other writers, he plagiarized a lot of people. But Virgil's great poem, The Georgics, which he read both in Latin and Dryden's well-known translation, that was a constant reference point. This long poem discussed aspects and the dangers of agricultural work in hostile environment in the 1st century before the Christian era. Townsend found it directly relevant to 19th century Australia. The Georgics, according to Townsend, and I quote, may be said to form the settler's handbook. They are in many respects remarkably descriptive of country life in New South Wales. Well, in contrast to the pastures and the wooded areas south of the Illawarra with which Townsend became familiar, Virgil actually described an Italian landscape dotted with vineyards and olive trees, which on the surface offered few points of comparison. But Townsend nevertheless found Virgil's advice highly applicable to his newly discovered environment. Books shaped the settlers' vision of Australia. They were an interpretive tool deciphering a strange land. The coastal climate, Townsend claimed, reminded him of Rome. The poet talked of cattle branding and beekeeping in a fashion which Townsend easily recognized. Burning off, he observed, also had its parallels in the Georgics, and Virgil accurately described the various diseases of sheep. If one substituted cicadas for Virgil's locusts and grasshoppers, he could be read as a guide to agriculture in colonial Australia. So classical and canonical works could be Australianized. So turning to the canon. In the long-running BBC radio program Desert Island Discs, which has been going in some form or another since 1942, a celebrity is invited to imagine himself or herself cast away on a remote island. They're allowed to select certain items to accompany them on their imaginary exile. 8 records, usually musical works, which accompany most of the program, and 1 book. Only 1, because they are already automatically, virtually issued with a copy of the Bible and the complete works of William Shakespeare. British emigrants who found their way to Australia, whether by choice or by order of the state, also held fast to a number of Ur texts, which represented, as they perceived it, their heritage, their roots, and their cultural epitome. These were inevitably the King James Bible and the works of Shakespeare. I'm not going to consider the Bible today, but I'm going to consider Shakespeare, and I'm going to add at least one further pillar of literary Englishness to the master library of the emigrant, Charles Dickens. Now, these key texts were valued instruments in the dissemination of English or British culture, and the two were, English and British, were elided usually. British, although they're not really exactly the same. British emigrants viewed Australia as a literary terra nullius. British literary masterpieces filled a void and extended their own presence and authority. The English language was considered one of the greatest benefits bestowed by Britain to its colonized peoples, and the literary monuments of the past demonstrated its glory. Shakespeare and Dickens were in this way, if you like, complicit in the colonial project as a whole. Let me try and show you a slide. No, I can't. How do I move it on? Here's The Bushman's Dream, which appeared in the Illustrated Sydney News around Christmas 1869. The bushman falls asleep and he imagines in the sort of think bubble, which you can see, an English Dickensian white Christmas scene. And what inspires this dream? His reading. You can see there's an open book on the table and a couple of similarly bound books lying on the table next to it. Perhaps a 3-volume novel, what we call a 3-decker. But colonial readers didn't all read alike. Their experiences were diverse and situational. Their reading didn't passively replicate home culture. it also interpreted it and resisted it in unpredictable ways. So let me turn to Shakespeare, first of all Shakespeare and then Dickens, but first of all Shakespeare. I've picked out what I call the four faces of Shakespeare. First of all, Shakespeare was a familiar friend, always present in the home, an author one could reliably turn to for poetic sustenance or lively company. Louisa Meredith knew him so well that she named her horses Touchstone and Audrey after characters from As You Like It. Shakespeare was commonly invited as an after-dinner guest, as he was in Kathleen Lambert's Sydney home in 1844. Her parents, she related, were well-read, and Shakespeare was a household word, and most of his plays I have heard read by both, each taking part, suggesting that family readings were common. Other guests for the evening at the Lambert home included the English Romantic poets Byron, Wordsworth, and Shelley, as well as Pope and Moore, who all nurtured the rich Victorian culture of poetry recital, which we have lost. Shakespeare was a staple of evening reading in squatters' homes. Books may have been hard to come by for squatters in rural Victoria in mid-century, but Edward Kerr made sure he had Shakespeare in his own library of about 150 volumes. This was the library of an educated class, as Kerr himself noted. But Shakespeare was not exclusively the companion of the wealthy. Agnes Stokes, a recent English immigrant working as a housemaid in Brisbane around 1886, remembered that, I quote, "The butler used to fetch the evening mails from Milton Station. One night he left me to light up. I was in the pantry, leaning on his sink, which was covered like a table, reading Shakespeare. I always imagined Shakespeare as a little wizened old man who knew everything." So it's rather puzzling to me as a verdict, but it does suggest that Shakespeare mingled with the staff downstairs as freely as he did with the gentry above stairs. Just because Shakespeare was present didn't, of course, mean that he was actually read. His presence on the shelf could be purely for show to indicate the owner's superior tastes in good literature. So this is the second face of Shakespeare as a status symbol, as a sign of distinction. Owning and parading one's Shakespeare was to stake a claim to important cultural capital. Joseph Eliot, who lived in Adelaide in the 1860s, provides a good example. He had emigrated to Australia in 1850 when he was a 16-year-old apprentice printer. 10 years later, he lived in a 4-room house with his second wife and 2 children, and he proudly wanted to describe his new house for his mother back in England. And so he wrote a lengthy description of it, including the family's books and where they were kept, which is interesting information. Each genre had its particular uses and its own location in the home, culminating with the books in the parlor, the front room, the reception room, which was where they were on show to guests. These were well illustrated books, some with fine bindings crafted by Eliot himself. They were editions of books received as birthday presents, and on a center table of polished cedar stood choice books, as he called them, like the family Bible. And in the parlor were inevitably found, in a cedar cupboard of nicely bound books, the complete works of Shakespeare in 8 small format volumes. But nothing in his description suggests they were often, if ever, opened. In a small number of households, Shakespeare was considered too sexually explicit, and access to him was denied. This is the third face of Shakespeare. Young readers, especially young female readers, were shielded from his influence, and prohibitions also applied in some nonconformist Protestant circles, which had strict views about non-fiction as a whole. So this was the third face, Shakespeare as the face of dangerous knowledge. Annabella Boswell came from the landowning elite of New South Wales, taught by governesses. She went to school in Parramatta in the 1840s. She lived as a young girl on her uncle's property near Lake Innis. She was a very keen novel reader. She used the house as library as well as receiving a supply of books from the Sydney Library. But her mother banned her from reading Shakespeare. The family had Scottish origins and perhaps Presbyterian influences were at work. Similarly, Randolph Bedford, born in Camperdown in 1868, heard his father reciting the English poets, but he recalled evading censorship of his reading by a Puritan mother. My mother, he wrote, knew the Bible from Genesis to Revelations and glossed over the parts unfit for juvenile ears. She objected to Shakespeare as a ribald writer, but approved of Lamb's Tales. And okay, Lamb's Tales, this is how a lot of readers came to Shakespeare. Lamb's Tales from Shakespeare, designed, as you can see, I'm quoting from the title page, designed for the use of young persons by Charles Lamb. Actually, there were two authors here. Well, there were three, including Shakespeare, but there was Charles Lamb and his sister Mary. I call her Mad Mary, but actually both of them were prone to episodes of insanity. What they did was to summarize the main stories of the Shakespeare plays. They cut out the subplots, they cut out the sexual references, they kept Shakespeare's vocabulary as much as possible, which means that if you actually give this to a young person now, they would find the vocabulary pretty difficult, I think. Mary did they left out the history plays, too violent, and they left out the Roman plays. Mary did the comedies, and Charles, her brother, did the tragedies, which meant, incidentally, that Mary did most of the work. But as you can see, this is by Charles Lamb. Mary is not mentioned. Her contribution was not recognized. But this is the version in which Shakespeare was often consumed. Shakespeare's fourth incarnation was the most distinctively Australian. As many writers attested, Shakespeare was the bushman's friend. Shakespeare was essential reading in the bush. Even when books were rare, a portable Shakespeare was usually accessible. Bushmen had to travel light, but they were reluctant to jettison something as precious as a copy of Shakespeare, however heavy he was. When Randolph Bedford was working in the mid-1880s catching rabbits in country New South Wales, he didn't part company with his Shakespeare. Shakespeare, he wrote, must be carried if he weighed a ton, for he was meat, drink, and clothes, counsellor, mentor, court jester, and friend. Shakespeare would be passed from hand to hand and drawn on for recital and evening entertainment around the campfire. At Powell Creek Telegraph Station in the Northern Territory, a linesman gave William Linklater his one-volume copy of Shakespeare, quote, which I accepted quickly. For the next 15 years, it was my most treasured possession on the outback trails. And Linklater's account revealingly continued. Give us some more of Old Bill, the men in the cattle camps would say, Old Bill being Bill Shakespeare, and gather round. Their consistent favourites were Antony's oration, Wolsey's Farewell to Greatness, and several passages from Coriolanus and Henry V, particularly the speeches before Harfleur and Agincourt. Eventually, rough travelling in pack bags in which books had to lie next to cartridges and tins of jam reduced the volume to single leaves. Finally, I had to keep it wrapped in calico. In these examples from the outback, Shakespeare was not remote, he was not difficult to grasp. Henry Lawson fully domesticated Julius Caesar by interpreting the conspiracy as an insightful treatment of mateship. Brutus and Cassius were close mates, but like all mates, sooner or later, they had their differences. They would settle their Barney, of course, over a drink, in this case, a bowl of wine, rather than a beer. Shakespeare was indispensable, and copies of his works were well used to the point of disintegration. William Harney travelled through northern Australia, working as a barman, teamster, drover, stockman, and miner. He picked up a tattered copy of Shakespeare in a miner's camp and confessed that reading Othello moved him to tears, which embarrassed him in the presence of his fellow passengers on the stagecoach heading for Winton in outback Queensland. Nevertheless, he wrote, I carried that book for years until I earned enough money to buy another. It was my wandering friend. The Four Faces of Shakespeare I've picked out here doesn't really exhaust the range of roles he played in the lives of individual readers. Their responses were infinitely varied, and even individual readers could arrive at different interpretations each time they dipped into the same text. Clearly, there were unorthodox readings of Shakespeare, among them perhaps the proto-feminist reading of Macbeth, in which Anne Rusden found Macbeth himself despicable and a coward, but focused on and admired his wife's strength of character, even if she lacked, as she thought, moral guidance. The daring of a Shakespearean heroine could overshadow all else in the play. And Anne Rusden read consistently for independence and determination in female characters. So let me just take a drink and then I'm going to return to Dickens. One of the great honours that Australian readers conferred on Dickens was to name kangaroos after his characters. James Marr didn't give us, unfortunately, any details, but he recorded this enthusiastic response to his reading aloud of Nicholas Nickleby to a small group of workers on a Victorian station in 1840. Louisa Meredith went further in this zoomorphic interpretation of Dickens by calling her spaniel Dick Swiveller from the Old Curiosity Shop, while an unidentified sea creature was named Mrs. Gamp from Martin Chuzzlewit. Dickens was enormously popular in 19th century Australia. When Anthony Trollope visited in 1870-71, he found Dickens much in demand in Mechanics' Institute libraries, along with Macaulay, Scott, and Tennyson, and the volumes on the shelf were well worn. There was ample evidence, he remarked, of their general use. And similarly, when one reader at Melbourne Public Library in Swanston Street complained that Dickens was unavailable, he was told that the volumes were temporarily hors de combat. In fact, they have been thumbed to death. Dickens was part of a global reading community, and his appeal transcended gender, class, and geography. As Lydia Weavers wrote of the impact of Dickens in New Zealand, he played a key role in the transmission of Englishness. His books and fictional characters became common currency across the empire as a whole. Dickens's Antipodean readers did not simply enjoy Dickens, they interpreted the world through his creations. To take one example, emphasized by Kylie Mir Mohammadi and Susan Martin, Sydney newspapers represented Woolloomooloo and the Rocks area of Sydney as replicas of the criminal hideouts of Victorian London, where Fagin's school of young pickpockets thrived in Oliver Twist. And in this context, when a Sydney journalist when a Sydney journalist referred to Fagin or the Artful Dodger or the prostitute Nancy, he could assume that his readers knew exactly what he was talking about. In Melbourne, the Yarra River was an Australian River Thames, conjuring up pollution, suicides, and the dark trades plied by Gaffer Hexam and others in Our Mutual Friend. Dickens's attacks on the English legal system could also be used to criticize the colonial judiciary, and his idealization of Christmas in A Christmas Carol, of course, influenced the way it was celebrated everywhere, even if the climate made Northern Christmas cliches incongruous. Dickens had many uses, and his presence in colonial life, quote, makes it, like quoting those authors I just mentioned, his presence makes it possible to see how a collective imaginary can be an interpretive tool, a source of comfort, a critical mechanism, and an imperial grand narrative. But my focus is actually not on the newspapers, which Mir Mohammadi and Martyn used most of all, but on readers of books. How did they experience Dickens? What novels stuck in their memories? Well, Dickens' social commentary novels played a minor role, relatively speaking, in their enjoyment of his fiction. As for Great Expectations, the Dickens novel with the most explicit Australian content, it didn't figure greatly in the comments and memories of the autobiographies I've studied. For them, Dickens was, above all, stupendously entertaining. He was highly valued as a comic writer. And the most common reaction to his works recorded by 19th century autobiographers was laughter. And the chuckling started with the Pickwick Papers, serialized in 1836, 1837, published as a book immediately after, well known in Australia by the early 1840s. Just to note that it was published, like several of Dickens' novels, in installments, and this is what you're looking at here, the first installment. Because if you read a Dickens novel by installments, if you read it all the way through, you'd end up paying more than you would if you bought it as a book. But bit by bit, it could be, you know, it was affordable. The Pickwick Papers was the title that made Dickens a best-selling author, and sales soared after he introduced the character of Sam Weller into the fourth installment in July 1836. That's Sam Weller on the far left in the striped waistcoat. In the 1840s, the laughter could be heard in England's furthest colonies. Dickens readers established the Pickwick Club of New Zealand in Wellington in 1840, less than 4 months after the first settlers arrived in the harbour. And it imitated its original model by meeting in a tavern. So what do you do when you just arrived in a strange new country at the other side of the world? You set up a Dickens Club. Joseph Townsend, who I mentioned earlier, offered some advice for emigrants. The most acceptable present, he said, that could be made to any friend already in the bush would be a cask of English beer, and the next a copy of Pickwick. And Sam Weller's laborious attempts to write a Valentine card was a particular favourite in the penny readings, which entertained the public in mid-century Melbourne. After the Pickwick Papers, Nicholas Nickleby, published in 1839, and The Old Curiosity Shop, 1840, were popular texts for reading aloud in various settings. Elizabeth Webby's search of Australian newspaper advertisements in the 1840s found that those titles were precisely the ones that most frequently recurred. Australian newspapers reprinted a wide variety of titles over the century, beginning with the Pickwick Papers in the Sydney Gazette in 1838, continuing to Dickens's last unfinished novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, in Australian Town and Country in 1871. James Demar, who I've already mentioned, read Nicholas Nickleby to whoever would join him around his log fire. And some journeyed 7 miles to hear him and discuss the book. To them, he wrote, it was a real-life story, and their sympathies were all with the honest and good characters in the story. As for The Old Curiosity Shop and its popular protagonist, Little Nell, Annabella Boswell read it in a group of female cousins when she was 21 years old. The cousins liked to take the part of one of the characters. They gave Martin Chuzzlewit the same treatment, impersonating the Pecksniff daughters. I don't know if you're familiar with Martin Chuzzlewit, but there's one sequence in the novel which is set in a new American colony, which Dickens calls Eden. It's still very raw and very primitive. I was looking for some kind of resonance there with Australian readers, but I was completely disappointed. What readers loved best in the novel was the humour of the pretentious Pecksniffs and the alcoholic nurse, Mrs. Gamp. So above all, Dickens was fun, laced with some sentimental appeal. Later in the 1890s, an old curiosity shop actually opened in Cairns, plentifully stocked with stuffed reptiles. There was an alligator named Little Nell and an iguana named Quilp from that novel. Catherine Deakin, a sister of the Prime Minister, conducted a literary pilgrimage when she visited London and didn't fail to seek out the supposed site of the old curiosity shop itself, which is, well, it doesn't exist, but it was located in the novel in Holborn. In the 1850s, Ellen Campbell, daughter of a magistrate in the central western goldfields of New South Wales, loved Dickens amongst, quote, everything I was permitted to touch on my father's shelves. She could repeat pages of the old curiosity shop by heart before she was 11. She said she had laughed and cried over David Copperfield and Paul Dombey at an even earlier age. And just as laughing and or crying were general responses to Dickens's fiction, so too reciting and retelling the stories were essential ingredients of the reading experience. Ellen Campbell wanted more. She wanted to raise 15 shillings to buy a first edition of Martin Chuzzlewit from a peddler, which she had seen with its neat dark green binding and gilt lettering. She wanted to buy it for her mother's birthday, but it cost 15 shillings. So she went off collecting leeches in a waterhole and sold them to a doctor. She caught 20 live leeches at 6p a dozen and went to bed with bleeding legs. But she got the book in the end. Her father read it aloud, performing once again the oral and sensory experience that 19th century readers enjoyed. And when Henry Lawson praised Marcus Clarke's original version of For the Term of His Natural Life, he decided that the introduction was equal to Dickens's style, an indication that Dickens remained an influential benchmark for fiction writers. Lawson knew Dickens well. As a young man, he recalled borrowing David Copperfield from Mudgee School of Arts, but he insisted on reading the story a little bit against the grain. Micawber, according to Lawson, was not a man waiting for something always to turn up. In fact, he worked hard for everybody, and he died a respectable pioneer in Australia. An original Antipodean reversal of conventional interpretations. And there is Micawber and his family about to leave for Australia at the end of the novel. He's not actually on the boat. He's in the hotel on the quayside. So the autobiographers I've mentioned didn't all agree with each other. Their tastes differed, and there was rarely a united chorus of support or otherwise. How can I stop sharing? I don't know. How can I stop sharing, please?
I think you've stopped, Martyn, and I can just see you.
I want to stop sharing the screen. I can't see how to do it.
Hi, Martyn. If you just click the button at the top of your screen that says Stop Share.
No, I can't see it. It doesn't appear.
That's right. I don't think you're sharing your screen actually at the moment, so you
Oh,
can.
okay, I can carry on. Okay, Dickens had some readers who found him too difficult. John Shaw Nielsen decided Dickens is overboomed altogether, although he didn't make it really clear whether that reflected Dickens's Englishness, which he didn't like, his sentimentality, or his New Testament morality. Mary Fullerton, educated at home by her mother in Victoria in the 1870s, became very familiar with Dickens as part of the repertoire for family evening readings aloud. But in retrospect, she didn't give him an unequivocal endorsement when she recalled, "I remember that we often succumbed to the pathos which critics have nowadays discovered the great Englishman had in excess. Well, in the last 2 decades of the century, the autobiographies began to express unease about British literary references as English settings started to seem incongruous. And instead of reinforcing a British Australian identity, such references tended to encourage a sense of displacement. Readers grew more frequently intolerant of the Bushman's dream, which I showed you earlier. Alice Goldstraw, remembering her childhood in southwest Victoria, wrote of green swards, primroses, and mossy banks, drawing on the poetics of English pastoralism, and was shocked by her own false homesickness, her longing for a home that she had never seen. So the canon, like all literary canons, was unstable. It was changing, and it was growing more open to new homegrown Australian influences. But here I want to say that I think the strength of the imperial stranglehold may have been exaggerated, and in any case, its grip was weakening in the last quarter of the century. If we follow Catherine Bode into a study of homegrown fiction published in the press, a different story emerges. Because a lot of Australian fiction was serialized there. So perhaps Australian culture was not as derivative or as dependent as we previously thought. Of course, the periodical press also serialized English and other authors at the same time as Australian writers, and the Australian newspaper fiction database lists Dickens, Kipling, Paul Kane, there's Mrs. Humphrey Ward, and Robert Louis Stevenson, for example, as regularly serialized authors, not to mention the American Bret Harte, with 114 serialized titles to his name before 1914. But nevertheless, Catherine Bode successfully challenged the exclusively Anglo-centric model of 19th century Australian reading. Now, if we always envisage the Australian reader, as some historians tend to do, right? If we tend to envisage the Australian reader in a fixed, narrow framework, constantly oscillating between English novels on the one hand, Australian fiction on the other, we won't succeed in representing his or her complexity and wide range of interests. That framework, of course, I admit, did provide the parameters for the second volume of the history of the book in Australia, as the subtitle, which I myself helped to choose, was supposed to encapsulate a national culture in a colonized market. The scholar Tim Dolin also saw Australian readers as members of an emerging nation, but embedded within a cultural space filled with mass market British fiction. According to Dolin, readers were, quote, stranded between two dominant manifestations of modernity, namely nationalism and international consumerism. I would prefer to suggest, on the contrary, that Australian readers, the ones I've been studying here, felt in no way stranded. And that Dolin was outlining a false problem. A problem perhaps for a nationalist historian in the 21st century, but not for most 19th century Australian readers who read British, Australian, other literature painlessly and without a second thought. So I take a broader view. I've been talking about the English canon, but I want to put that in perspective. I'm taking a broader view of Australian literary culture. Australian readers didn't only read British popular fiction. They read American fiction. They read some European novels, although the readership was more limited for that. And especially if they were male, they read the classical literature of Rome and Greece, very much part of boys' education in the 19th century. Their focus was broader than the historians I've mentioned usually allow, partly because those historians have unduly prioritized the novel. There's an incredible focus on the novel at the expense of other things that people were reading. The novel has been asked to carry alone the torch of national literary identity, But to give it this heavy responsibility in the 19th century is anachronistic. If we want to find an Australian literary identity in the last decades of the century, we won't find it in the novel. We will find it in poetry, short stories, and children's literature. So this focus on the novel, which dominates book history, that's my view, hides the importance for us of Ruskin, Carlyle, Macaulay to Australian readers. It hides the enduring power of poetry, whether it's British, Australian, American, or translated from Latin. And it hides the overwhelming significance of Bible reading, sermons, hymns, and prayer books, which I don't have time to go into today. So I'm looking for a richer and more inclusive view of 19th century reading. I'm coming to a conclusion now. If I take my cue from any of the distinguished experts in the field, I take it from New Zealand book historian Lydia Weavers, who unfortunately is no longer with us. Weavers warned that readers display diverse interests, anxieties, and transitions. Their choices are not monolithic, and they are usually more adventurous than national expectations allow. Readers, for Weavers, quote, are not more attracted to the literature that their taxes subsidize, or because they live in the same country as the author. Readers do not usually have a loyal or patriotic relationship to their own literature, and when they fail to exhibit such reflexes, there is no need to construe this as a problem. Readers, in her terms, are feral, and the feral readers of colonial Australia roamed widely and sought out their abundant prey in many different corners of the forest. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much, Martyn. I'm just going to check that people can hear me okay. A couple of people weren't able to hear me at the beginning of today's talk. So are you able to hear me, Martyn?
I can hear you, yes.
Excellent. So we will crack on. For those of you who did miss the introduction, I can assure you that I acknowledged country. I said something very charming about Martyn, and I did, of course, invite you all to think about questions, because it is kind of unusual that we have such a bookish person here in the library's fellowships program. So it is an excellent thing to take advantage of. So I'm just going to pop in, and we have somebody saying, oh, very pleased, and yes, I did pick up on this, very pleased to hear you mention Anne Rusden. She was also a critic, was she not? And the question is it a kind of control of text, whereas some of your other readers seem entranced by text? That's very interesting. Have you come across any other readers who were critics like Anne Rusden was?
I haven't, and I owe the reference to Anne Rusden to Paula Burton, who may be the one who raised the question just now. And I'm grateful to her for bringing the Rusdens to my attention, and there's plenty of evidence there of their reading, not only their reading, but how they got hold of the books they read and some of their responses to them. I don't have any further information, but I refer you to Paula.
Okay, we'll take that as a note. I was really delighted to hear you talk about some of these authors as after dinner guests. I think that is just perfect, because I was actually having a conversation with a friend of mine earlier in the year, and unless you're diligent in watching the 6 o'clock news or you go to church, there are actually very few occasions where adults have the opportunity to be read to anymore by other adults. And it is actually, I think, a very generous thing to read aloud to another person. I have a friend who occasionally reads me poetry, and it's excellent, and people don't often do it anymore. What can we do to change it, Martyn?
I think probably very little, but yes, reading aloud is reading aloud has survived. I mean, historians, book historians and reading historians often try to analyze the rise of silent reading from the 18th century onwards, because of course reading aloud, collective reading, used to be the normal way of reading. And of course, it's a way of reading that tends to strengthen community values. It's not a way of reading that encourages individual criticism. It's not a way of reading that encourages dissident views. It's sort of everyone joining together. And the family readings, which I think you just referred to, Rachel, they also, of course, carry with them an element of censorship. I mean, it's usually the paterfamilias who's doing the reading to the rest of the family, and often that's a way of controlling what they're consuming, because he can censor as he goes what he considers unfit for his daughter's ears or his wife's ears. So be aware of that aspect of reading aloud as well. Reading aloud, we come across lots of examples of women reading aloud. It's sort of a well-known feature of female sociability. You get round in a sewing group and somebody is reading while the others sew. But what I would like to say as well, and what I've given a few examples here today, is that it's also a part of male sociability. We see these bushmen sitting around the fire talking about books and reading extracts from books as well. So let's not forget that aspect too.
We did have a little bit of it during the plague, which was quite delightful. Lots of people reading aloud. But we have another question about if you have any comment to make on the percentage of reading of fiction and literature compared with reading factual materials such as newspapers or perhaps some scientific texts that certainly were available in the colony at the time, although possibly in much more limited numbers.
It's impossible to give a percentage. I mean, this isn't a kind of thing you can quantify from autobiographies. You're going on purely qualitative sources, and they carry lots of traps in themselves. It's not something you can quantify at all. But of course, there's plenty of, as I was saying at the end of the talk, there's plenty of non-fiction reading, and I wish people would pay more attention to it instead of focusing always on novels as though the novels was the only thing that counted. They read history, and they read. There's a lot of religious reading, not just the Bible, hymn books, prayer books, sermons especially. There were many readers who read only that, who never would go near a novel, who would find that too decadent and corrupting. This was the common sort of Protestant view in the 19th century. So we've got to widen the view, yes, to include the sort of scientific works that you're talking about, reference books, but especially the religious reading, which went on alongside the fiction reading.
I'm going to try and squash in one more question. I am very conscious of the clock, but you've spent decades researching publishing and reading and writing and all of these things, was there anything in the collection during your fellowship that really stood out as a whimsical surprise or something that you just thought, oh, I'm so glad I found that?
Yes. Yes, but slightly off the topic, slightly off today's topic. I was interested because I became interested not just in the reading, but also in writing practices. And there are some incredible personal diaries in the collection, and collections of correspondence, which I think no one's ever looked at, ever, which are wonderful illustrations of everyday writings, what I would call everyday writings that people were doing in this period, and just recently acquired, I believe, Ethel Turner's commonplace books, which were 3 of them, a great surprise, and also very, very interesting, showing, for example, her fascination with Gilbert and Sullivan operettas. I don't think that we knew that about her before.
Well, it's fabulous that there is still surprises here in the collection, things that we've held for a very long time. And of course, we are constantly building our collections for scholars and for everybody. So that is all we have time for today. It's been a fabulous talk, Martyn. I've really enjoyed it. I hope that everybody here is able to join us next time. So November, it will be our last Scholar Talk for 2024. So if this is one of the things that you always come to, and I know that there are lots of regulars in our audience every month, don't miss it. So Dr. Peter Gibson is an early career researcher, and he was our 2023 Dr. A.M. Hertzberg AO Fellow. And he did a really interesting project around the Shops and Factories Act, which was one of the first sort of really quite strong industrial pieces of legislation here in New South Wales. But it doesn't just protect some workers and employers and regulate shops and industries. It was actually used as a mechanism of discrimination against Chinese workers. So do come along for some of the first really robust research done on that particular piece of legislation. Until then, stay safe. There's lots happening here at the library on site and in real life. So thank you for joining us today, and I hope to see you again soon. Thanks, Martyn. Bye-bye, everyone.